She didn't leave because you cared too much. She left because you showed it the wrong way. Right after a breakup, everything in you wants to react. The emotions hit hard: confusion, frustration, sadness, the urge to fix things before they're completely gone. You start thinking about what you could say, what message might change her mind, what explanation might make her understand. And without even realizing it, you begin to act from that emotional state. You reach out, you try to reconnect, you explain yourself, hoping she'll see your side differently. And in your mind, it feels like the right thing to do. It feels like effort, like you're fighting for something that mattered. But from her perspective, it sends a completely different message. It doesn't show strength, it shows emotional dependence, because in that moment, she's watching how you handle pressure. Not the kind of pressure that comes from everyday life, but the kind that reveals who you really are when things fall apart. And when you react immediately, driven by emotion instead of control, it tells her that your emotional state is tied to her decision. That's where attraction starts to fade, not because you cared, but because you lost control of how you expressed it. There's a difference between feeling deeply and acting impulsively on those feelings. One builds connection, the other creates imbalance. And most men don't see that difference until it's already affected the dynamic. When you chase after she leaves, when you try to convince her to stay, when you over explain or over invest in trying to fix things, it removes the space that attraction needs to exist. Because attraction doesn't grow in a place where one person is pulling and the other is stepping back. It grows in contrast, in curiosity, in a balance of emotional control. And the moment that balance is gone, when you become the one who is overly invested, overly available, overly reactive, you shift the dynamic completely. You go from being someone she chose to someone trying to be chosen again. That's where most men lose, because instead of allowing the situation to breathe, they rush to control it. Instead of letting her feel the absence, they fill every gap with words, messages, and emotional energy. And in doing so, they remove the very thing that could have made her pause: your composure. This isn't about not caring, it's about understanding that how you respond matters more than what you feel. Anyone can feel strongly, but not everyone can stay grounded in those feelings without letting them dictate their actions. And that's the real difference, because the moment you lose emotional control is the moment she stops seeing you as the man she was attracted to. Right after she leaves, your instinct tells you to do something, to reach out, to explain, to make sure she understands how you feel. It feels uncomfortable to sit in that silence, like something is missing that needs to be filled immediately. And because of that discomfort, most men rush to act. But what they don't realize is that in trying to remove the silence, they remove the very thing that gives them power. Silence isn't just the absence of communication, it's the presence of control. It's the ability to feel everything without reacting to it. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because when you don't immediately reach out, when you don't try to reconnect or force a conversation, it creates something that can't be replicated with words, space. And in that space, something important happens. For the first time, she has to experience life without your presence filling the gaps. There's no message waiting for her, no reassurance, no consistency she's grown used to, just the reality of your absence. At first, she might not notice it deeply. She might assume you're just taking time, dealing with things, or waiting for the right moment to reach out. But as that silence continues, it starts to feel different. It no longer feels temporary. It starts to feel intentional. And that's when it begins to affect her, because when someone is always available, their presence becomes normal. It blends into the background, something expected rather than appreciated. But when that presence disappears from completely, it creates contrast. And contrast is what makes people pay attention. She starts to notice the difference in small ways. The times when she would normally hear from you but doesn't, the moments when she expects a reaction but there's none, the conversations that would have happened but now don't exist. And those small moments begin to build, not into something dramatic, but into something persistent, a quiet awareness that something has changed, that you're no longer there in the way you used to be. And that awareness slowly turns into curiosity, because now, instead of you thinking about her constantly, she starts thinking about you. She starts wondering what you're doing, how you're handling things, whether you've moved on. And those questions don't come from anything you said, they come from what you didn't say. That's the difference. When you react, You give her answers, you remove uncertainty, you make everything clear, even if it's not in your favor. But when you stay silent, you leave room for interpretation. You allow her mind to fill in the gaps. And the mind always tries to make sense of what it doesn't understand. That's why silence feels so powerful. Not because it forces anything, but because it allows something to develop naturally. It gives her the space to feel your absence, to notice the shift, to question what she thought she knew about you. And that's something no message could ever create, because sometimes the strongest statement you can make is choosing not to say anything at all. When you stop reacting, something unexpected begins to happen. The pattern she was used to, the one where you reach out, try to reconnect, or show emotional attachment, no longer exists. And when a familiar pattern disappears, it creates a gap, a space where certainty used to be. At first, she might not recognize it clearly. She might assume it's temporary, that you're just taking time or processing things in your own way. But as your silence continues, that assumption starts to feel less solid because your behavior no longer matches what she expected from you. And that's where things begin to shift, because when expectations are broken, the mind naturally tries to make sense of it. She starts to question what changed, not just in the situation, but in you. The version of you she understood doesn't seem to exist in the same way anymore. And when something doesn't align with what we believe to be true, it creates tension. That tension doesn't come from anything you said or did. It comes from the absence of what she thought would happen, the absence of your reaction, your pursuit, your emotional expression. And in that absence, questions begin to form. Why hasn't he reached out? Is he really okay without me? Did I misjudge how he felt? These questions don't come from you chasing, they come from you stepping back. Because when you stop giving immediate answers, you leave room for uncertainty. And uncertainty is where curiosity begins to grow. This is the part most people don't understand. They think attraction is built through constant communication, through explaining feelings, through trying to maintain connection at all costs. But in reality, attraction often grows in the space between interactions, in the moments where someone doesn't have all the answers, because the human mind is wired to fill in gaps. When something is clear and predictable, there's no reason to think about it deeply. But when something becomes unclear, when behavior changes without explanation, it pulls attention. It creates a need to understand, to figure it out. And that's exactly what happens here. She begins to think about you in a different way, not as someone who is emotionally available and predictable, but as someone who is now unknown, someone whose thoughts, feelings, and direction are no longer obvious. And that unknown carries weight because it shifts the dynamic. You're no longer the one trying to understand her, you become the one she's trying to understand. And that reversal changes how she experiences the situation, not because you're trying to manipulate anything, but because you've removed the pattern she relied on. And once that pattern is gone, she's left with something she didn't expect, uncertainty that she can't control. Because when you stop reacting the way she expected, is the moment she starts trying to figure you out. Stoicism isn't about pretending you don't feel anything. It's not about becoming cold, distant, or disconnected from your emotions. It's about understanding them without letting them control your actions. And that's where most people get it wrong. After a breakup, emotions are intense. There's a natural urge to react, to say something, to do something, to relieve the discomfort as quickly as possible. And in those moments, it's easy to believe that acting on those emotions will make things better. But more often than not, it only creates more instability. What Stoicism teaches is something different. It teaches you to sit with those feelings without immediately responding to them, to acknowledge what you're experiencing without letting it dictate your behavior. And that level of control is rare because most people don't pause, they react. When you choose not to react impulsively, when you choose to stay grounded instead of chasing emotional relief, it sends a message without needing to say anything. It shows that you're not driven by temporary feelings, that you're capable of maintaining your composure even when things are uncertain. And that composure builds something important, perceived value, not because you're trying to appear valuable, but because you're no longer giving your emotional energy away freely. You're not seeking validation, not trying to fix things out of panic, not overextending yourself to regain what was lost. You're simply holding your ground. That changes how you're seen, because when a man reacts emotionally, It often signals that he's trying to regain control of the situation through effort. But when he stays composed, it shows that his sense of control comes from within. And that internal stability is what people recognize, even if they don't fully understand it. Over time, this creates a contrast. Most men react, most men chase, most men try to fill the silence as quickly as possible. So when you don't follow that pattern, when you remain calm, focused, and steady, it stands out not in an obvious attention seeking way, but in a quiet, undeniable way. And that's what makes powerful. Because Stoicism isn't about suppressing who you are, it's about refining how you express it. It's about choosing discipline over impulse, clarity over confusion, and control over chaos. As you maintain that state, something shifts internally as well. You begin to trust yourself more. You're no longer at the mercy of your emotions. You're aware of them, but not controlled by them. And that awareness brings a sense of stability that wasn't there before. That stability becomes your foundation. It's what allows you to move forward without being pulled back into old patterns. It's what keeps you grounded when things feel uncertain. And it's what makes your presence or your absence carry weight. Because when a man can master his emotions instead of being mastered by them, his value speaks for itself. When you're always there, always responding, always available, your presence becomes something she gets used to. Not necessarily something she consciously takes for granted, but something that blends into the background of her daily life. It becomes normal, predictable, expected. And when something is always expected, it rarely feels special. That's why, in many cases, the value of your presence isn't fully recognized while it's there. It's consistent, reliable, and accessible, which are all good things, but without contrast, those qualities don't create emotional impact. They simply exist. But the moment that presence disappears, everything changes. When you step back completely, when you stop reaching out, stop reacting, stop being available in the way she's used to, it creates a shift that can't be ignored. Because now there's a difference between what was there before and what's there now. And that difference is what creates emotional tension. At first, it might feel subtle, a small awareness that something is missing, a moment where she expects to hear from you but doesn't, a thought she wants to share, but there's no one to send it to. These moments don't seem significant on their own, but they begin to build over time. And as they build, that awareness becomes stronger because absence has a way of amplifying what presence could not. When you're there, your presence is part of the routine. But when you're gone, your absence becomes noticeable. It creates a gap that wasn't there before. And in that gap, emotions start to surface, not because you're doing anything, but because something that once existed is no longer there. This is where the emotional trigger begins. She starts to feel the absence, not just logically, but emotionally. She begins to notice how often you were part of her day, how much space you occupied in her life, how your presence contributed to her sense of normal, and that realization can be uncomfortable because it brings a level of awareness that wasn't there before, an awareness of what's missing, of what's changed, of what may not come back in the same way. This isn't something you force. It's not something you create through effort or communication. It's something that happens naturally when you remove yourself completely and allow the reality of your absence to exist. And that's what makes it powerful because it doesn't rely on convincing or explaining, it relies on experience, on what she feels in those moments when you're no longer there to fill the space. Over time, that feeling becomes more defined, not necessarily overwhelming, but consistent. A quiet reminder that something is different, that something she once had is no longer part of her daily life. And in that realization, emotions begin to shift because when someone truly feels your absence, they begin to understand your value in a way they couldn't before. At some point, you realize that trying to get her back isn't the real goal. It might feel like it in the beginning, like if you just say the right thing, do the right thing, become the right version of yourself, everything can go back to how it was. But the more you focus on that outcome, the more you stay tied to something that already ended. And that's where most people get stuck. They spend their time chasing a result instead of building themselves. They wait for a response, a sign, a moment where things might shift in their favor. And in that waiting, they lose momentum, they lose direction, they stay connected to the past instead of moving forward into something new. But when you shift your focus, when you stop trying to win her back and start working on becoming better without her, everything changes. Your energy changes. You're no longer reacting to what happened. You're responding by building something different. You're not trying to fill a void anymore. You're creating a life that stands on its own. And that shift isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, steady, and consistent. You begin to invest in yourself, not for validation, not to impress, but because it's the right thing to do. You work on your discipline, your mindset, your goals. You create structure where there was once emotional chaos. And as you do that, your sense of identity becomes stronger. Now, your direction isn't dependent on her return. If she comes back, it doesn't feel like a victory, it feels like an option because you're no longer the same person who needed her presence to feel complete. You've already built something within yourself that stands independently, and if she doesn't come back, nothing changes either because your growth wasn't tied to that outcome. It was tied to your decision to move forward. This is where the real transformation happens. You stop chasing outcomes and start focusing on who you're becoming. You stop seeking approval and start building self respect. You stop attaching your worth to someone else's choice and start defining it for yourself. And that's what makes it powerful because when a man reaches that point, when he becomes grounded in himself, when he no longer needs external validation, when his direction is clear, regardless of circumstances, he becomes something rare. Not because he tried to be, but because he stopped trying to be anything other than real. And that authenticity carries weight. It changes how you show up, how you speak, how you move through life. It removes the need to prove anything. And in that space, something shifts in how others perceive you. But by then, it doesn't matter because you're no longer doing it for them. You're doing it because it's who you've become. And that's the real trick. Not getting her to come back, not making her beg, but becoming the kind of man who doesn't need that outcome to feel complete because the moment you stop chasing her is the moment you become the one she can't replace.